Good day, everybody. Thank you once again for joining me. It is my pleasure to keep meeting with you like this. We had an interesting question in last week's video posted after the fact. It was from Rob, and it's a good question. I'm going to deal with it today. Just so you know, I don't respond to those comments in typing, but if you want to write me a note about a subject you would like, I'm happy to consider it. Also, if you'd like one-to-one in-person coaching, actually via Zoom, we're doing the coaching room now every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So go to my website, you can find out how to log in, and we can perhaps have a conversation directly via Zoom. So Rob says, I have a question about souls that come to Earth with mental disabilities and challenges of nature like autism and severe Down syndrome. Their awareness and consciousness is tremendously beautiful and kind and have challenges in the world like we do. Can you discuss the transition of such a soul regarding death? Well, I don't know if we'll get to the death part today, but I want to really talk about the purpose of someone who lives a life with a certain disability. And I want to go back to two jobs I had over my lifetime working with disabled people. The first was back in my 20s or so when I was living in New Jersey, and I volunteered to work at a VA hospital, Veterans Hospital. And I had no idea what I was getting into. If I knew, I probably wouldn't have done it. But my soul knew. And I offered to teach a light yoga class. And when I entered, I was stunned to see the suffering that was happening in that place. Everybody was in a wheelchair. Most of them were stroke patients. Some had degenerative diseases. Their diapers smelled. The hospital staff was understaffed and grumpy. And I had never seen such a depressing scene before. So I gave my class. And I went home stunned because I had never been in the presence of such limitation before in my life. And I actually forgot to go to my third week. I literally forgot because I didn't want to go. And I realized that if I was going to do this, I was going to have to shift my attitude somehow, that I could not go on and on and on and just go there and be depressed. And it was kind of a funny crowd. There was one lady, Mrs. Jensen. She was probably 80 years old, and she sat in her wheelchair. I did like little light yoga head movements and light arm movements. And this lady had no legs beneath her knees, and every minute she would go like this. She would like stick out her tongue and bulge her eyes. And I thought, wow, this lady really doesn't like me. And later, the doctor told me it was some kind of involuntary response. But I've seen in her teaching, she goes, nah. Oh my goodness, and she doesn't like me. But she was actually a very sweet lady, and I made friends with her. And I developed really nice relationships with them. And I decided that if I was going to go there, I could not afford to see them as sick and disabled and pathetic. That I would have to raise my vision of them. Otherwise, I couldn't do it. I would just be burnt out real quickly. So I decided not to pay attention to their infirmities, but to regard them as whole, empowered, ageless, even youthful souls. And when I did that, everything changed. I used X-ray vision to see beyond the physical appearance of their infirmities. And I started to have a lot of fun. And I would give them meditations where I would say, see yourself 19 years old running on the beach. And a voice from me said, how cruel is that, Alan? These people are all 70, 80 years old and they have no legs and they can't move and they're paralyzed. And you're telling them to see themselves running on the beach. That is cruel. But they loved it. They elevated to a mental realm where they remembered what it felt like to be 19 and to be fully abled. And these big smiles would emerge on their cheeks and these tears would roll down there. And I was like, oh my goodness, we're onto something here. And more and more and more people came until it became the most popular class in the hospital. And there was a line of wheelchairs waiting to get into the room when I would show up. And I remember the scene from Field of Dreams at the end of the movie when all those cars are lined up waiting to come to the baseball field. That was what it was like. And I might have been one of the few people in a hospital who did not see them as sick and old and frail and victimized. I held the consciousness, and they were thrilled to meet me there because they did not want to see themselves as sick either. They wanted to feel free. They wanted to do the little yoga they could. They wanted to smile. They wanted to have a happy meditation. And I ended up doing that class for 7 years. And after I moved away from the city, one of my yoga students took over, and she carried on for many years after that. And I remember going to visit Mrs. Jensen, the tongue sticking out lady. And I went to visit her in her room. She couldn't come to class, and I think she was dying. She was pretty weak. And I just sat there, and I just held her hand, and I looked in her eyes. She was so beautiful. She was such a radiant, just an innocent soul. And she was one of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen because her aura was just heavenly. And that woman who frightened me so much at the beginning became saintly. She became like my best friend. And we didn't say a word. I just held her hand and looked in her eyes. But the communication was absolutely complete. And that was one of the great relationships in my life with somebody whose body was pretty messed up, but her soul was shining. And I'm hoping I'm answering the question, Rob, because what we want to do is shift our vision from the world of appearances, which are always deceptive, always distracting, and shift it to the world of spirit, which always recognizes wholeness. Now, my second job, which was a paid job, I needed some money, so I decided to work for, it was called the Association for Retarded Citizens. That was the name in those days. And I was a supervisor at a sheltered workshop. And these people were classified in those days severely and profoundly retarded. And they had the IQs like of 10. And they would be shipped off to this workshop, and they would supposedly have jobs for the day, and we would interact for the day, and they would go home. And these people were pretty scary too. They were physically disfigured in some ways and hunched and crunched, and they couldn't speak, and they would make animal-like noises. At first it was scary. But then once again, I started to develop relationships with them. And I could see that there was somebody in there, that they had this contorted body, but there was somebody in there, there was a soul in there. And if I could just contact their soul, we could have a connection. And I remember these people were very childlike, and I would bring my guitar, and at lunchtime I'd play like I've Been Working on the Railroad. And these people go crazy. You think they were at a Michael Jackson concert. And they would laugh and clap and smile. Come on, Alan, more and more and more. They were very childlike. And every day they forgot that I played I've Been Working on the Railroad the previous. Oh my God, he's going to play I've Been Working on the Railroad. Let's go for it. And they would all cheer, and it was pretty fun because they had these very childlike minds. And we had a couple of Down syndrome clients there. And of course, they were just the sweetest, most heart-centered, innocent, loving people. I mean, they were all about hugs and connection. And you just had to fall in love with them. And I was trying to figure out how that all happened on a spiritual level. And they had basically chosen a life where they bypassed the intellect. They did not have these heavy, burdensome, thinking, confused minds that many of us do. Our left brains are way, way overdeveloped. At least we use them too much. And they just operated from their creative, childlike, innocent right brain only. And I thought, well, they're really that much worse off. Of course I wish they were healthy. Of course I would like to see them functioning well. But they had chosen to develop another soul quality for that lifetime. And I truly believe that they were suffering less than most people with all their faculties intact. I think they were, in general, happier people. Once again, I'm not making light of their disabilities. They were a challenge, and to their families and to the community. But at the same time, they had things going on within them. They were seeing and knowing things that most people don't. I realized, well, maybe that was just their choice for this lifetime, and they were developing something else that most of us don't. And so I learned many, many things from that job. I developed relationships with those clients too. But it was only when I quit seeing the physical appearance and I x-rayed vision into their soul. Those were two of my best learning experiences in my entire life. They were difficult, but I really gained a lot from them. Course in Miracles says, what you believe are some of your greatest advances are really soul retreats because they're ego advances and your soul is going backwards. And what you believe are some of your biggest setbacks are actually opportunities for the greatest soul growth. So the Course in Miracles says that the world is inverted. So you may think, well, wow, I had sex with that person with a really hot body. Or I got this fabulous job and I had this coup in business where we had a hostile takeover and we won and we made lots of money. Or I got that mortgage for this super expensive house and I might have to sweat for years and years and years and worry about paying my mortgage, but I got the house. And there's nothing wrong with sex and offices and houses. They're all good, but when our value system becomes inverted and we start becoming enamored with things of physical, material, then we very often lose sight of our spiritual truth, which is that we're divine beings here to learn and grow spiritually. On the other hand, you can have a material setback, such as a physical disability or an illness, and there are things you can learn and grow through it. For example, I work with people who are disabled physically, not the two I mentioned, but others. And I see these people learn patience. Let's say you're immobilized for a while. Something that used to work doesn't work so well anymore. There's an element of trust that you develop. Humility, you become humble because all of a sudden you can't control your whole life. That's a form of humility. You learn to let help in, let people help you. A lot of people who suddenly they're paralyzed or have some kind of disability, they had a hard time letting people help them. They build up these stone walls, these armors, and they don't let people in. And suddenly I have to ask for help. And it's humbling, but it's a beautiful thing when you can allow people who want to help you to help you. A lot of people, through an illness or disability, they develop their spiritual faculties, and they start to recognize that they're not a body. I mean, look at Helen Keller. She was a very spiritual person, and she had to tap into resources that were beyond sight and sound. She had to develop spiritual sight and spiritual sound. And you also develop your relationship with higher power. So I'm not suggesting you need to be disabled, need to be sick to do these things, but when that occurs, those are some of the opportunities and doors you can walk through if you choose to. Now there's some other benefits too to the community. One is that you give other people a chance to help you, which actually serves them. I think I learned more through those two jobs than the people I helped. I grew more through that than the people I helped, perhaps. There was a guy in our community who dove into the ocean one day, a beautiful 40-year-old guy. He hit a rock, and he was instantly paralyzed. It was really rough, and he was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He was quadriplegic in one moment. And so a number of his friends volunteered to go visit him. They took shifts to help this guy. And I would go once a week and help him for a couple hours. And, I had to wash his hair. I never washed a man's hair before. And I had to clean up after him and feed him and, do errands for him. And, it really helped me to help him. It was a beautiful time. It was challenging in some ways, but I was so glad to help him. The satisfaction I received from washing his hair and feeding him was so sweet. I have very positive memories. I'm sorry he was ill, but it gave me a chance to give love in ways that I might not have given it at other times. And the last teaching related to it is that people who have good attitudes when they're ill or disabled, they're demonstrating stuff that you wouldn't see otherwise. For example, Ram Dass. A lot of you know Ram Dass. He passed away last year. But he had a stroke in his late 60s. He was in his wheelchair for like 20 years after that. And I spent a lot of time with him. And his attitude was so loving and so accepting and so kind. I never heard him complain. I never heard him going to why me. I saw no pity, no self-pity. He would laugh. He would make fun of his predicament. He had, these sweet jokes about what was going on with his body. And he was constantly seeing people. He was coaching people. He held retreats at his house. He held an annual big retreat at a hotel on Maui. And here he was in a wheelchair, one side of the body paralyzed, and he just remained pure love. People loved Ram Dass because he was a teacher of love for many years. And then after he took on this hardship, he remained an amazing teacher of love. And I thought, well, if he can live in that situation and not complain, then I can certainly face any challenges I have, physical or emotional or anyway. And, I don't need to complain about stuff. And I remember I did a workshop with him once, and I was interviewing him. I played devil's advocate for a moment. I said, what would you say to somebody who said, there's so much suffering in the world, and I don't know how I can go on, and there's so many people who are hurting, and why should I be happy? And it's just a really hard world. What would you say to that person? And Ram Dass, with few words at the time because his speech was slow, he said, change your mind. So his prescription for suffering was to change your mind. And then there was a guy in the VA hospital. His name was Willie Vaughn, a beautiful black man with a lovely bald head and these little eyeglasses. He was quadriplegic. And he was the light of that hospital. He just had a kind word for everyone. He was like a flame. Like if you came in from a winter's cold day and sat around a fireplace and put your hands out and let the heat come onto your face, he was such a light bulb that all the patients would gather around him. And these bug-depressed medical workers, the doctors and the nurses who were also bugged, they would hang out with him. This guy would just tool around the hospital. And he was like a light bulb. He was not stopped by his infirmity. I'll never forget that man. And it was around that time that I wrote my first book, The Dragon Doesn't Live Here Anymore. And I had a launch party at my house. And I invited Willie. And the hospital arranged for a van to take him to my house for the evening. And he came in with his wheelchair and his little lap board. And he made a toast in his own way. And, I don't remember much from that evening. It was a lovely evening, but the fact that Willie came, that was sweet. He enjoyed getting out. He enjoyed connecting with people, and he's an amazing inspiration. He's one of the lights of my life. And he was stuck in a wheelchair. He's quadriplegic, but he just held the vision and held the light, and he chose to be the light. And Jesus said, you are the light of the world. Do not cover the light with a basket. Course in Miracles says the same thing. It says, my grievances hide the light of the world in me. So when we drop our grievances, the light really comes forth. So bottom line for this message is that, yes, there are hardships in the world. Yes, there are people who are disabled. And yes, there are spiritual opportunities for them and for those interacting with them. And the main spiritual opportunity is for them and us, or if you happen to be disabled, for you, to hold the higher vision, to use X-ray vision, to see wholeness and see perfection. Course in Miracles says, do not see error. It also says, do not see bodies. Now, it's impossible to go through the world and not see the bodies in error. But what I think it's really saying is, get your mind off of the limitations of the body and pierce through to the spirit of that person, which is absolutely whole. All those people in wheelchairs at the VA hospital were whole. Their bodies were having a hard time and they were limited physically, but mentally and emotionally and spiritually, they were absolutely whole. Those, quote, retarded people were stuck in messed up bodies and their intellects were messed up, but there was something in them that was bigger and greater and wholer and more holy and more magnificent and more perfect and more beautiful than anything their bodies were doing. And that is the whole key to this game of working with a physical plane, period. And of course, physical limitations as well. So we're all on a learning curve, we're all in school, and yet we can graduate from that school by mastering the lessons that the earth brings us. All things are lessons God would have me learn, and a happy outcome to all things is sure. Thank you for joining me. I love you. I hope this is valuable to you. I'll see you next week. Aloha.